This week's episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 26th of April 2022 at home in Wicklow. And it is very much a mental health episode because I go into a discussion of what we listen to in ourselves, particularly in moments of unwellness, in moments where in moments when we're feeling very embattled. And I've been reflecting on the last couple of years, and it's definitely been a bit of a tricky time in my life, and I've been just looking at some of the bumps in the road and observing my own behaviour, my own reactions to things, and my own sort of emotional and psychological landscape. I had a milestone in my relationship the other day, and I found myself in not great form, and so I wanted to sort of own that and look at what's got me to this point and how best to sort of view myself and my headspace and where I'm at. And so in the episode I really sort of look at listening to the deeper voice within, the deep respondent self is what I call it, and to try and find solid ground from which to move to a new, healthier space. And that is very much the larger thrust of the episode, just an exploration of how we deal with the not so great moments, and how we deal with feelings of perhaps defeat or failure or whatever they might be. A lot of feelings that fall into the sort of the negative bucket, and just trying to keep it real and to be unafraid to look at the less attractive parts of yourself and the less attractive kind of moments in your life, and to view it honestly and dispassionately, and then try to proceed from there with a better range of options. So that's as ever that's what's coming up. Explorations of wellness, explorations of the mess within, and hopefully I certainly bring some clarity to my own thinking, and that may be of use to you as well. Okay, so I hope you get something from it. I will see you right there real soon. Cheers.
Not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. Welcome. How are you today? What are you saying to yourself at this moment in your life? What is the prevailing narrative? What's the monologue which won't leave your brain, which won't leave your sense of self? What is that voice saying? What's it saying to you? Does it approve? Or am I imagining that this is a voice that everybody has? I don't think so. I think we've all got it, haven't we? Haven't we all got that inner voice? It's one of many, but there's usually a dominant voice, a dominant commentator, the witness. And the challenge, the wellness challenge, is to become a witness to the witness, to rise above it all. Let your astral self leave your body, like Doctor Strange from the Marvel comics. He was always a very interesting character to me. Something very psychedelic and esoteric. Now he's played by Benedict Cumberbatch. That name always makes me laugh. By Benedict Cumberbatch in the movie version of the character. I'm not entirely sure what I make of him. Something of the mysticism has been lost. I don't know. I don't know to what that can be attributed. If it's just Cumberbatch's, I don't know. I feel like I'm about to. I feel like I'm about to besmirch his essential nature as a performer. There's something very solid and unmysterious about Benedict Cumberbatch. He's a bit of a slab, a bit of a well-spoken slab. Although I will repeat that I did very much enjoy his performance in The Power of the Dog. Anyway, Doctor Strange used to be able to leave his own body because he was a mystic, a magician. A magician? He didn't do tricks, but he possessed magical powers. And he'd float outside himself and go on these astral ventures, these astral journeys, voyages, and look down upon himself. So he was able to disembody himself, but retain consciousness in the disembodied form, and the disembodied form would be semi-visible. Well, for the sake of the comic, he was invisible to others, but that is what I was advocating there moments ago, to rise above ourselves and witness, and then go, oh yeah, there's that voice, there's that inner voice yammering away, jabbering away. It's a very convicted voice, as in a voice with a lot of conviction. That self-talking voice, the self-observing voice, as I refer to it, the commentator. And I suppose the challenge then is, how much credence should you give it? Because on one hand, I actually really value a deep listening. But then I suppose I would argue that deep listening goes below the voice, or beyond the voice. The voice, although it comes from within, is sort of out. It's a funny one. It's inside us, and yet it's outside of events. That's probably quite a good way to think of it. It's outside of the events of our life, responding, commentating, note-taking, offering opinion, framing, reframing. But there's a deeper, truer voice that is in us all. And that is the voice that is connected to our core selves and our core respondent self. That's what I believe. And that's the voice that we have to listen to, and we have to sort of get through all the white noise of the busy brain and the turbulence of our emotional state, and go very deep and go, what is the base state, and what's the voice that's coming from here, which gives us the true read of where we're at. Because I think that's where we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves. That's where knowledge of what is defining us can be found. And yeah, I do believe that. Now we can talk about epistemology. Epistemology from the world of philosophy is the study of knowledge. And epistemology essentially asks the questions, what can we know? What is the extent of what we can know, and where does knowledge come from? How can we frame it? How can we be sure of what we know. Now, last week I referred to two philosophers I admire, John Locke and John Stuart Mill. And Stuart Mill, a utilitarian, and John Locke, an empiricist. And empiricists were very much informed by the sensory encounter of the world and what could be sensed and understood via the senses in a sense experience way. And there's a scientific application to that as well. And if you are listening to me talk about the deep voice within, the deep voice at the base state, the defining state, the defining respondent self, now that could also just sound like a load of balderdash. Absolute gurgly nonsense. And yet I have enormous faith in that reality, which scientifically I've no idea what can be proved in that area. That's when I need to get a neuroscientist on to talk to them. Maybe that's something I should look into for a future episode, and they can expose all my touchstones as nonsense, just shibboleths. So I'm thinking in this area. I'm thinking in this area today, because I have found myself. I've been reflecting on the last couple of years, the pandemic years. The title of my second memoir. The pandemic years, which coincided with my wife and I and our daughter moving back from Australia to Ireland, a massive relocation, quite a tricky time in our lives, and we just had our little kind of 2-year return to Ireland anniversary last week, and I have to kind of hold my hand up and look at myself over this 2-year period and go, it's definitely been a turbulent time, emotionally, psychologically, and I don't know if I could say. I'm hesitating because I don't want to misrepresent myself. Never stopped me before, says you. But I'm just hovering around the dreaded H word, happiness. And I don't know, this whole idea of happiness as it's presented to us, particularly in the coming from the sort of the wellness sector and the wellness industry, and I've touched on this often, how skeptical I am about this hyper positivity that comes from the wellness sector, and a lot of wellness advocates in the online space, and I suppose that's I'm one of those too. Let's be completely transparent here. I am one too, although I argue that my version of wellness is quite far removed from the general template of performed, curated, kind of positivity and hyper achieving, success oriented, goal oriented formula of how to be well and how to be happy. I kind of crap all over that. I just go, oh no, will you stop? Just be real, be normal. Just stop the act, and it's okay. It's okay to not be at the pinnacle all the time. And I read just the other day a definition of, I don't know if it was a definition of happiness or wellness or good self-esteem. Maybe it was around the area of self-esteem, or that self-regard, that self-relationship, which was basically to acknowledge how flawed you are and still approve of yourself is an indication of a healthy relationship with yourself. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that is basically, that was basically the thrust. And I think, that's where I come from fundamentally. It's not like love your brokenness, love your wound, love your pain, but it's to be very accepting of that, and to be very accepting of the complexity of who you are and the areas of yourself that perturb you and disturb you. Is there another herb? And suburb you. That doesn't work, does it? I'm perturbed, I'm disturbed, and I'm suburbed. A story of living in Temple Oak. Temple Oak, that's a suburb, the suburb in West Dublin that I used to reference in my mind when I was trying to explain to Irish people where we lived in Melbourne and what it was like. I was like, well, it's kind of like Temple Oak. It was a very innocuous, nondescript suburb, perfectly acceptable, but with almost nothing to recommend it. It's like the definition of bland. My wife used to really chomp at the bit, just to kind of go, oh my God, get me out of here. Just craving something more interesting and, a bit more diversity and colour and yes. Anyway, so there you go. I'm suburbed. But yeah, the point I was trying to make was that the relationship, an indication of a healthy relationship with ourselves might be to go, there are many aspects of how I function, of how I think, of how I feel, of how I am, that I don't really care for, that are problematic in some way, to a lesser or greater extent, but I still have a high approval rating of myself. That a high approval rating, that feels like that's a relatively recent coinage from the review language of the net. A 5-star review, a 4-star review, high approval rating on Uber or on Google reviews. So most of the time, in spite of my own individual internal struggles, which I have spoken about before, generally, I think at this stage of my life, I'm like, no, I'm okay, and my approval rating of myself is generally high. My wife would roll her eyes at that, because she'd be like, I think your approval rating of yourself is a little too high. But I defiantly refuse to not be mindful, not be aware of the positives. I think there's enormous value and worth in going, hold on, that's working, that's okay, that stuff is good, and that stuff actually is the stabilizing, like, in combined form, it becomes the stabilizing element of my life, and and in a general sense, of one's internal world, or of one's personality. The stabilizing elements are probably what allow you to function, and are probably what allow you to have good relationships and be productive and leave your house in the morning and go out in the world. So I'm all for acknowledging them and even celebrating them at times. And speaking of celebrations, yesterday was my 19th wedding anniversary. but I wasn't feeling particularly celebratory. I have found the last few years quite demanding in that area of my life, and yeah, it actually wasn't an easy day at all, and that's probably what has me in such contemplative form this morning, because I've kind of been asking myself and I mean, I'm not trying to ring any massive alarm bells. So those of you who know me, it's all right. Everyone stay calm. I'm just leaning into my conviction that speaking about things honestly. Now, on the podcast, that's in a very controlled state, but nonetheless, it's an area worth exploring, I always think, and particularly, look, I mean, what's the bottom line? It's easy to talk about stuff when it's going great. It's easy to, to share and be open when you're in a position of strength. Like that comes naturally to most of us, and because it happens within a comfort zone. And again, I mean, I just had an injection of energy verging on anger in my voice. I don't feel angry about that. I mean, that's just a very natural way to be. When things are good, it's easy. It's easy to share. It's easy to be open to connecting with others. It's easy to reach out, and it's easy to be visible. But when things are not that, when things are the opposite, then it's truly challenging. And it can be extremely challenging depending on how extreme that might be. And I certainly know from my own experience, particularly through my 20s, when I hadn't really come to terms with the nature of my own kind of wrestle with depression and my own wrestle with negative events in my life and where that would send me. And, before I, sought help, through therapy and got a bit of perspective on that, that could be really extreme. And even still, occasionally a depressive episode can send me under. And, at its worst, it's just a complete, I mean, talk about leaving your body. I don't know. It's almost like your body leaves you. That's how I would describe it, because it's just this incredible feeling of weight and inertia, like in a physical sense. I mean, we often use inertia in a kind of a more metaphorical sense, but a real genuine resistance to movement. Like the body just goes, I'm a dead weight and I'm not going anywhere, because because fundamentally, and again, this is I'm speaking purely from my own experience, the animating spark of life is extinguished at that moment, and it can last for a day, or a few hours, or a couple of days. Thankfully, it's generally no longer than that. But that, the reason I'm referring to that is because there's a through line to not feeling well, not feeling confident, not feeling positive, and being uncomfortable with being present, and being uncomfortable with putting oneself out there. That's all I'm saying. And at its extreme end, it is like a depressive state. And then if you jump across to a world, the world of substance dependency or medication dependency, where there's a desire to put an even greater buffer between oneself and the world. I mean, it's, I don't know, like, even hearing myself say that, like, what does that tell us? What it says to me is, my goodness, humans, like, we're pretty fragile on a lot of levels, and very, very gettable by the world as in, we can be we can be hurt, we can be wounded, we can be destabilized. And to be in the world and to be open is to be affected by what's going on in the world. I'm very accepting of that. I'm like, yeah, that's the deal. That's the, and speaking of deals, that's that was something I didn't really go into in a couple of episodes ago when I was talking about the 4 agreements of, and Joe, I hope you're listening so you can get this pronunciation, the 4 agreements of Don Miguel Ruiz. My Spanish speaking friend reached out to me and said, listen, by the way, there's no U sound in Miguel, which I think is how I was pronouncing his name before. She's like, it's just Miguel. Hola Miguel, ¿qué tal? So when I was speaking about those agreements from the book, the 4 agreements, which I still think is got some very solid stuff in it, I did want to ask the question, what agreements we make with ourselves. And I just said a second ago, the deal is, we're here, life is here, life is all around us, and engage, get amongst it. Don't be afraid to live. Don't be afraid to mix it up. Don't be afraid to have a few skirmishes. Can you hear that? Can you hear that bloody rooster in the background? It's like it has a sixth sense. It's like, okay, I'm going to go and wreck this guy's head. I'm going to park myself outside the window and squawk my head off. He must be listening because he just stopped. There you go. Did you hear it? My God. Anyway, yes. Now, the deal. I was just thinking of other deals. I know I'm wandering a bit, but I'll bring this back on track, I swear. Here's another example of a deal I make. I don't go down to the sea not to swim. There you go. That's a deal. So and I used to say this when I was in Melbourne and swimming more frequently than this. I don't go down to the sea not to swim. I don't make that effort to take myself to the water to not get in. So in my mind, that's the deal. Unless it is unsafe to do so. Okay? For all those worried mammies out there, safety first. Yes? Yeah. So in any case, to come back to what I was talking about, the events of the last few years have been demanding. They've put pressure on my relationship, put pressure on my wife, put pressure on myself. There have been a lot of challenges and a lot of difficult stuff to negotiate, and some of that stuff we've negotiated very well, and some less successfully. And after, as I said, after not feeling terribly celebratory yesterday on my 19th wedding anniversary, and feeling really quite flat and quite disengaged and disenchanted in many ways, I just found myself reflecting on just trying to kind of get a handle on things this morning, because what I do recognize and what I would advocate is there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with feeling stuff. There's nothing wrong with feeling, what we would typically, describe as negative emotions. So, feeling despondent, or, feeling cynical, or feeling, having feelings of, of failure, or feelings of loss, or feelings of rejection, or feelings of judgment, or resentment. I mean, none of those, they're not what we think of when we think of, can you name, 4 or 5 or 6 positive emotions, Dara, or, positive sensations in your brain. They're not. They typically be cast into a negative space. But rather than thinking in positives and negatives, if we go with a more kind of Zen Buddhist way of thinking, you just go, look, it's not negative or positive, it just is. And I'm unafraid of those feelings. They're not pleasant. They're not filling me with joy. My inner commentator isn't going, well, this is nice. This is a nice change from the norm. The inner commentator recognizes, this is pretty shitty, actually. So I'm not afraid to kind of experience them, but I will say I don't advocate wallowing. To wallow and flounder about and be submerged in those feelings doesn't feel particularly healthy. And I think as soon as I sense there's a space in my brain or a space in my respondent self to go, okay, hold on a second, what's the way forward? Like, what's the way out of this? What's the optimum response to this? Because it's easy to get stuck. And I think that's quite a common, I would argue that that's a common enough experience or a common enough sensation or a common enough belief that that sense of stuckness, of being unable to transcend, of being unable to shift. And I'm just going to tell you right now, in the world of martial arts, if you can't shift off your line of defense, you're going to get hit. So it's very funny in the style of karate that I do, Shotokan, the typical dynamic of attack and defense is linear. It's straight ahead and straight back. That's what we are. When we teach it and when we learn it, that's how it's taught for a very long time. And how we train our basic techniques is linear, up and down a hall, up and down a training space. And then later, as you start to do sort of free fighting, where there's freedom to move and range and roam, the young practitioner can be perplexed by their inability to have more variety of movement in their fighting style. But they've been sort of indoctrinated into this, going forward and only moving backwards. But later, as you know, and I know now as an instructor, you're really trying to encourage people to move off that center line, move off that line of defense and attack, and that's when you can change the dynamic. And so don't stay stuck on that single axis, that single line of attack and defense. Move around, change the dynamic. And what that makes me think of, to bring it back to what we're talking about, this idea of being stuck, movement is so important, because it's so easy to get stuck in our heads. It's so easy to get kind of locked in sort of the paralysis of analysis. Now, I know I haven't coined that. I've come across that phrase before, or analysis paralysis, where you just get stuck in the kind of the chin stroking, interesting, and that just becomes very ponderous and dry and cerebral, and that's its own, that is a stuckness of its own. So, and this is where we come back to the idea that you see a lot of wellness advocates talk about, and I'm not being cynical now, but health practitioners and wellness advocates, they talk about body work, and basically I think what has become a very clearly advocated tenet of wellness practice is, talking and thinking can only do so much. Now, as you know, I wouldn't have a podcast if I wasn't a great advocate of talking and thinking on the spot. But movement is of such enormous benefit to breaking that cycle of the mental hold and the mental grip, the cerebral analytical grip on our reality. Get that body moving, change your position, and it can be as as obvious as, you know, lying down on the floor, or as as I watched in I was listening to a podcast about Dead Poets Society, the 1989 Peter Weir film, where Robin Williams is the inspirational teacher who kind of radicalizes in the non-fundamentalist sense, who radicalizes and excites the imaginations and energies of his young English students in a very repressed, stuffy prep school in New England. And I remember loving it as when I first saw it. I mean, I guess, I would have been 15 or 16 when I saw it. I remember going to see it with a couple of pals, I think in a cinema in Arklow, and I found it very, very effective. It appealed to my innate idealism. Now, I mean, it's aged well in ways I didn't expect, and hasn't aged as well in the areas I might have expected. Robin Williams, when he's being serious, is good, like serious and sincere. His, the brief indulgence of his comedic stuff is far less interesting. The young cast perform with such enthusiasm that it carries the movie along. But the cinematography is actually beautiful, and the score is very effective as well. But in any case, referring to changes of perspective and movement and getting the body moving, Robin Williams in the movie famously gets all of the students to each stand up on his desk at the head of the classroom, just so they can change their perspective and view the world a different way. We are such fundamentally, simple animals on that level that it does have an effect. Using the body in a different way, moving the body, sitting down, lying down, standing up, walking around. I've introduced a nice little practice into my morning routine. Did I mention this last week? A friend reminded me of a chi practice that I first saw in acting school many years ago, which is basically a standing pose with the arms out in front holding an invisible circle. It can be quite tiring on the arms, but what my friend sent me, I kind of dug in a little bit, and there's a lovely aspect to it, a preparatory aspect, where you walk in a circle for however long you see fit. But the idea is you walk in a circle to put the internal organs in motion, with the celestial bodies above. And then you come to a place of stillness and hold the form for as long as you can, with a nice open back, and let your, basically an empty chest and a full belly, and you breathe. And I mean, just thinking about it now calms me down. And I've also, speaking of other calming exercises, I've also taken to sitting at my wife's piano. That's not a euphemism. Sitting at my wife's piano to just have a noodle on the piano. I don't play music. Okay, I'm not, and there's no false humility here. I don't play music. I don't know how to play the piano, and I'm not sitting down trying to read music and play something. So I'm sitting down and I'm just trying to make nice sounds. And basically what I do is I'm kind of falling into this sort of habit of just playing chords. So I'll press 2 or 3 keys at a time, and then I might do a sequence and move up or down the keyboard and play with varying intensity in terms of how much weight I'm applying to the keys, and just fall into a sort of a rhythm that probably isn't particularly melodic. almost not melodic at all, but the sounds are nice, and in my opinion, they go well together and they hang together. But it is in no way a piece of music. It is in no way a song or a melody. Okay, so I'm just, that's my, I'm just arguing very strongly here for my disclaimer I make. There's no claim to budding musicianship here. What I'm saying is it's just nice to sit at the piano for 20 to 30 minutes and do that. I find it incredibly calming. And I keep using that word, calming, and you go, wow, how calm do you need to be? Well, this is part of my kind of confessional episode today, because part of what I was going to say, and I've referred to this before, but there have been times over the last couple of years where I've been surprised by the level of anger that can be present in me. Already that's very kind of, I'm already using distancing language. There is anger present. Explosive rage at times. Just a release of intense frustration and anger, which, mostly, I don't know. No, I was going to say mostly I'm trying to find positive outlets for that. That's one of the reasons I do as much exercise as I do. And that's the body work, isn't it? To try and just keep myself on an even keel. So, again, I don't want to misrepresent myself. I'm not lurching through the day, with barely contained fury. But anger has come up enough that I'd have to raise a flag and go, hold on a second. This is not really in balance. And then that pushes me, and I go, okay, so what's the deeper unease beneath all of this? What does and I don't know if I've coined the phrase, but I do like this idea, the respondent self. The deep respondent self. What does the deep respondent self have to say about that? What's at the heart of this? What's at the root of it? Where is it coming from? And is it an expression of anger? Or, as often is the case with anger, is it an expression of defensiveness? Is it an expression of hurt? Is it a reaction to a deep wound? And relax. I'm not going to try and self-therapy myself. Any more than that. So I'm going to remain speculative for the recording of this episode, and I can inquire further on my own time. You'll be greatly relieved. But joking aside, as a tool of self-therapy, I do advocate that deep listening. Now, here's the thing. Do you want to listen to yourself? Do you want to hear from yourself? Because many of us are afraid to look. Many of us are afraid to listen. Many of us find ways, consciously or otherwise, to do the opposite of that, to take us further and further from the place that is always speaking to us. See, this is the thing. There is no escape. There's no escape and there's no hiding from the deeper stuff within. So it doesn't matter what you do, and it doesn't matter what story you tell yourself. It's there, and it continues to be there, and it continues to be there in ways that are potentially very unhealthy until you sit down with it, until you face it, until you allow yourself to be present with it. And then see what happens. And the more you're afraid of it, or the more you don't want to listen, or the more you don't want to look, the more powerful it is, and the more defining it is. And in my opinion, it's an impediment. It's something that holds us back. It's something that slows us down. It's something that doesn't allow us to express ourselves fully, in which case we're living a compromised existence. In which case we're not out in the world giving ourselves the best chance to thrive. And again, I'm not going to specify, because I'm not going to specify what that thriving might look like, because that's different for every individual. Like, that depends on what you value. That depends on what you want. That depends on what's important to you. But yeah, I think there are times. I mean, this isn't about a constant checking in with the deep stuff, because that might be unrealistic. It might be exhausting. It simply might be too much. It might be something you don't feel capable of doing outside a therapeutic space. But I still think it's something worth engaging with, and trying to identify and trying to focus in on in a calm and non-judgmental way, and go, oh, okay, that's just there. And this brings us back to the idea of, which I've spoken about before, the idea of looking at oneself as an object, rather than being caught up in the subjective reality all the time, because the subjective can bring a lot of emotion, and the subjective can bring a strong sense of right and wrong, good and bad, whereas the objective view is much more detached and can bring a sort of a healthy neutrality, which is, that is not to dismiss that part of looking at that might be to admit, oh, that is actually something that really hurts, or that is something that makes me really sad. But if you're viewing it from within the hurt, or within the sadness, or within the anger, your perspective is skewed by the strength of those emotions, by the strength of those feelings. So, and like, this is the thing, when we're trying to get a perspective on ourselves, or a perspective on our lives, and our viewpoint is from a highly specific environment, and so let's argue that, speaking emotionally or psychologically, we can put those ideas into environmental terms. So if I'm in a heightened state of psychological distress, like anxiety or depression is psychological and emotional distress, or psychological and emotional dysregulation. How we judge ourselves, or how we assess the perspective, then is not neutral. It's incredibly stacked in a particular area, and it discolors things, or colors things in a very particular light, which will not necessarily be truthful. And so for me, the quest then is, what feels true and accurate to me? And from there, if I'm satisfied that I establish that truth or that accuracy in terms of what I'm trying to understand about myself, or what I'm trying to understand about what's going on in my life at the moment, I find that then becomes a very reliable, dependable starting point for further inquiry, for further exploration, for making a shift in a different direction, for trying to assess what my next options can look like, because I trust that I've established something concrete, and then I can kind of step off from there. And again, when you're trying to step off from the line of an attack, you want to be stepping off something solid, if you know what I mean. Yeah, if I'm trying to push myself off the ground in a fight situation and move off the line of attack, when I place my weight into that leg, onto that foot, and I want to feel that I'm pushing into something solid from which I can push my own weight away from the danger, away from the attack. So I'm applying that idea metaphorically then. If I can get a really good grasp of what's going on with myself, emotionally, psychologically, then it's a great starting point to launch my my next move, from which I can achieve ultimately a position of safety. And if you want to put it in terms of conflict, it might be a place from which I achieve victory, not over my opponent, but over my own previous inability to protect myself. So a victory over a loss of control. So if I bring it back to talking about anger, what I would like at the moment in my life is to kind of go, okay, I need to look at this, and I need to find some solid ground from which I can get a victory over an anger that is unhelpful and disruptive. And it's very disruptive to myself. And certainly if my wife or our daughter bear witness to it, which they don't have to most of the time, thankfully, that's not good. That's not good stuff. And it's not to just it's not to legislate anger out of my emotional scale, because anger is valuable in terms of, it's telling me something like, okay, this is real. So now I need to dig deeper and go, okay, where is this coming from? And that brings me back to, the broader theme today is like, the listening, the deep listening. And it also for me raises the question of, if I'm interpreting, to stay in the specific at the moment, like if I'm interpreting feelings of flatness, or if I'm interpreting anger as being indicative of some form of dysfunction, or some form of defeat, or some form of collapse, definitely an indication of frustration. How do you live with that? How do I live with that in this moment without catastrophizing it? And then this is where this phrase comes to mind that I've been encountering a lot in different conversations and things I've been reading. Esther Perel, the relationship expert, who's quite a fascinating person. You should check her out if you haven't. That's Esther, there's a TH in that, Perel, Perel. You'll find her on social media, and there's books, and she has a podcast. But she was talking about, radical acceptance. You've heard me speak about this before a little. Radical acceptance is very much, I think, applicable in this area of being accepting of the and this is my phrase, but being accepting of the broken world. And I'm not talking about the larger brokenness of the world. We're talking about, international conflicts and the wealth gap, and, just so many areas of, concern, and areas of, public failing I mean, that is the broken world, and we do have to have a bit of a radical acceptance. But it's funny, it's probably a lot easier to accept that than a broken world that feels like this is your own world, your own personal world, your own relationships, your own work, your own kind of dynamics with yourselves and your intimates, and that's a much smaller world, generally speaking. And when that feels broken, that's far more confronting, I would argue, because we can sort of intellectualize and distance ourselves from the larger problems of the world, and that's what most of us do. I mean, you know, some of us do a little, some of us do a lot, some of us don't do anything at all. And I'm not judging anyone. Live your life, you know, because you have to keep yourself well and stay right in yourself to do your best and be of use to others, which again that's an area of wellness, you know, your utility to others. If that's, you know, you can derive value from that. But I think if you're placing your happiness or your wellness only on being of use to others and not being of use to yourself, that's not good. That doesn't work. That's a bit of a faulty logic there. I'm so broken, I'll fix others and then I'll feel better. Wrong. Have a look at yourself first, and then you might not feel the need to fix anyone at all. I'm fine, see you later. Door closes, bang. Just make myself a nice cup of tea. La la la. But yeah, I think that is challenging, because there are definitely times, and I'm probably experiencing a bit of this myself in my life at the moment, where, you know, how do you live with a sense of defeat and, you know, not feel like, oh, well, that's it then. Just, you know, the give up gesture that, well, feck it, what's the point? But to kind of go, no, it's okay. That's just this moment. That's just this moment in my life. And I think a tendency can be to get stuck in the bad moment and allow it to invalidate everything else that is positive, and to allow it to invalidate things that are working and things that have worked and work that has been done. And that's what I'm talking about, when the perspective is skewed, but your brain is going, no, this is the right perspective, this is the truth, this is the true reality, and everything is, you know, X, Y, Z. It's not necessarily the truth at all. It's a truth. It's a version of what you can see at the moment, and it's a version of what your brain and your sort of emotional self chooses to focus on in the moment. But I think it is preferable to gravitate to that more neutral, non-judgmental space if you can, to go, okay, hold on a second, what's going on here really? What's this really about? And what are your resources? What are your responses? What can you actually do here to shift the lens a little bit and to move to a position that's going to give you a better chance to rally and recover and restore yourself? And from there you can try and engage again. So that idea again of listening, the deep respondent self. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read something I wrote on the blog about 5 years ago, because I dedicated a piece to this idea of listening, and I'm just going to read you kind of the latter part of the article, because I was kind of putting it into a larger context of who we listen to, who we choose to listen to, whose comments and whose opinions we value. And I was kind of trying to go, well, how much do we actually let into our heads over a lifetime? And I kind of, and what the relationship is then to truth, and what we believe to be the true reality we find ourselves in. So I'm just going to read you here. It's probably about 4 or 5 paragraphs that conclude the post, and I'll include it in. I'll throw in a link in the description of this episode, so you can go and read it if you want to. So this post was called "Listen," and I concluded it with these paragraphs. I said, "But at what point is what we hear no longer revelatory? Or is that an unduly negative perspective? That saying, 'nothing new under the sun,' does it reflect an inclination towards cynicism and ennui? Or is it merely that our brains are locked in a holding pattern, determined by the limitations of our imaginations? As if we have a finite number of formulae, of templates that help us frame the world, and once we've allocated them, we can't take on board anything else." I mention this in the context of listening because if, as many current commentators would have us believe, we are more and more subject to the culture of the echo chamber, it means we are only listening to one thing. And if we are only listening to one thing, it means we are listening to nothing else. We become victims of like-mindedness, to wit, the unbelieving bewilderment of US Democrats as they digested the ascent to the Oval Office of someone they had categorically dismissed as a buffoon. Where were the voices of dissent? Who was saying that Trump should be taken seriously? The point being, it behoves us to listen for something that is more than a soundbite or a credo we have already told ourselves. If we are only capable of recognizing our own rhetoric, our own framework, then we are in danger of, at best, complacency, and at worst, dishonesty. And this is far from being a battle waged only on the outside. What about our own voice? When do we listen to ourselves? To say our brains are busy is something of an understatement. The figure of 70,000 thoughts a day in a typical human brain seems to be an anecdotally accepted minimum. That's a lot of sifting to get to something resembling gold. Like the MacGuffins famously used by Alfred Hitchcock, so many of our thoughts, coming from various inner voices, are misdirectors, signposts pointing the wrong way, or else distractors to suspend our progress. I suggest it takes a very special quality of listening to isolate the voice worth hearing inside us. Perhaps we need some of that dream-seeing quality referred to at the top of the post. Our daily thoughts merge with our weekly thoughts, which become part of our monthly thoughts, all of which are enmeshed in our yearly thoughts, until we have to admit that our thoughts, perceptions, insights, voices, notions, memories, fancies, and daydreams comprise a vast miasma of conscious and subconscious processes that are a testament to a life lived so far. What truth is it possible to extract from that? Well, maybe it's just a numbers game. The truth is the thoughts or insights or demons that have been given most airtime. It is up to each of us to work out why we've admitted some truths more often than others. So it's not truth then, it's just traffic. But it's our city, our roads, and we can decide which roads we close and which ones stay open. Yeah, okay. So that was from 2017, I guess. Let me see. Yeah, March 2017. And it's, well, I like it. I put there's a cute photo of my daughter, who I guess was only 3.5 then, with a big pair of headphones on. She's a dote. That's there on that post as well. So maybe that'll persuade you to go and have a look at it. As I said, I'll put the link with the description. So, yeah, I mean, I've been, this is not the first time I've reflected on the benefits of listening and sifting through what's real and what's more dependable or credible or reliable than other things. Yeah, there you go. So look, that's where I'll leave it for today, I think. A slightly shorter episode for a change. Thank God, says you. What else was I going to talk about today? I know there were a couple of other things. Yeah, I liked the idea of talking about holding the space in that same context of just being present. Being present. I mean, sometimes the language we use around wellness can put us off. I find that, oh, Jesus. But I mean, I probably, instead of holding the space, I'd say, yeah, be present. Just be grounded. Be here. Be okay with yourself. Be unafraid to be seen. But holding the space, that's a very buzzy phrase that's being used at the moment as well, along with radical acceptance. Yeah. Do you know what I can't hold anymore? My steaming knob. That's also not a euphemism. On my coffee machine, the steaming knob, the knob for the steamer, has broken. And there you go. Now I remember. So I have to use a pliers to turn the mechanism, to turn the steam on and off when I'm trying to make some nice froth for my latte, my twice a day latte. And when you get the froth wrong, you have a bad latte. When you get it right, and the strength and amount of your coffee is right, you get beautiful coffee. And last week I just lost control of the pliers I was using to hold the mechanism, the sort of the bolt that turns. That bolt used to be turned by this little spherical knob, and the steam actually wore away the bottom of the knob. Geez, I'm in very dodgy territory here. Now, boys, don't wear away the bottom of the knob, or it'll fall off when you're making those coffees. Yeah, and I lost control of it, and my little jug of milk was just having I couldn't turn the steam off, so my little jug of milk overflowed before I was able to get a grip on this little pliers I was using to turn it off, and milk went everywhere. And in my fragile state, I couldn't handle it, and pliers were thrown and milk was thrown, and the top of a big stove was hit. It wasn't a good moment. It wasn't a good moment. But that is one of my pet hates. That's a trigger for me. Things that don't work. There's nothing that will get me angry as quick. If I'm not in kind of solid enough form, there are a few things that will get me angry as quick as something that doesn't work properly. It tips me off. It's so juvenile, really. That was my relationship with Lego when I was a kid. I used to just smash it because it wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. Now, that really wasn't the Lego's fault. You know that. I know that. But that is where I would draw the line back to that impulse, and it's still in me. This bloody coffee machine. Anyway, there you go. So I have to replace my steaming knob, and I don't know how I'm going to do that. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to reach out. I'll tell you something else. Now, I'm kind of doing this in reverse. I usually start with the stupid anecdotes, but I'm ending with them today. If you've heard me talk about Ruby, Ruby, the marketing assistant for the podcast. If this is your first time to listen, I'm going to quickly reveal Ruby's a cat. So the head of marketing is our other cat, Marlon. And for a while there, when I was first doing the podcast, I was quite amused by that idea of assigning business roles to the animals who live here with me in #blessed. And I'm not referring to my wife and my daughter when I talk about the animals that I live with. But the two cats form the marketing department. And Marlon, the older cat, she's getting old. Just like the idea of naming the cats as, having business roles. Marlon is going to be 20 next month. Very impressive. Fair play to her. But yeah, I think that idea of calling them marketing assistants and head of marketing, and the chickens here, that's the finance department because of eggs, and eggs can be a metaphor for money and wealth and accumulation. But that idea of calling them those things probably got a bit old. I certainly got over it because I stopped referring to them as such. And you know what else gets old? Kitty litter. There you go. That's what I came into today in the little recording studio here at #blessed. An upturned kitty litter tray. Because Ruby, who still qualifies as a kitten, she's less than a year old, she's somewhat overzealous in her post kitty litter routine. So cats like to give it an old scratch and make sure they've covered up their business. But Ruby, must have perched on the edge of the kitty litter and toppled it. So basically there was a half a used kitty litter tray scattered across the beautiful rug that's here. The rug that sits on a carpet that I think contributes to what I think is a rather nice acoustic in this room. So that's what I came into. I was like, bloody hell, Ruby. Oh man, kitty litter. Yeah, hopefully she'll get better. Just been a little bit tidier, or else she's just gonna have to get drop kicked out the door every time she wants to use the loo. That won't work either, though. You know that, and I know that. Okay, and I know that this is the end of the podcast for now, for this week. I'll be back next week, and I anticipate that I'll be in somewhat jollier form. So let's both look forward to that. And I say both because I mean me, the one of me, and the one of you, the one listener out there. The listening numbers were poor for the last last week's episode hasn't gone down well at all. I was like, what the hell's wrong with you people? That was a great episode. Tolerance. What do you tolerate in yourself? What I'm no longer going to tolerate is my anger. How about that? For now, anyway. Don't get me wrong. Anger's okay. I don't have any issue with anger generally. It's how it's expressed and what's it responding to. Okay, I'm not going to dig myself a hole and go backwards. Let's go forwards. Take care. Thanks for listening. Please do reach out on social media. I really appreciate it when anyone puts out something there on social media to go, do you know what? I like that podcast. Dara has a good podcast. Listen to the Clear Out. It's good. So you can do that if you like. The podcast does go out on YouTube at the Clear Out Podcast. The Clear Out Podcast is also on Facebook and Instagram, if they are platforms you use. And if you like Twitter, the Clear Out 2. That's the Clear Out with the number 2. You can find me there. And if you ever want to email me, it's the clearoutlive@gmail.com. If you want to send me a response, if you want to send a suggestion for something you'd like to discuss, if you even thought there was a guest you'd like me to try and pursue to see if they'd come on the podcast for an interview, anything at all, don't be shy. Don't be shy. It's okay. I don't bite. Okay, that's it. And you can also support the podcast using the supporter link, which you'll find in the description. Or if you want to support the podcast, you can do so on Patreon. So that's patreon.com/the clear out. If you want to throw a small regular financial contribution to the podcast to help me keep my faith in it as something that has potential to do well and be self-sustaining. that would be great, because it takes a bit of effort and a bit of work to shoehorn it into my life, and I like doing it, and I hope to continue to do it. So there you go. This has been the Clear Out Wellness with Attitude. Decluttering, clarifying, connecting. I hope I connected with you. Thanks for listening. Mind yourselves. I'll talk to you real soon. All the best. See you. Bye.